Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of the most bizarre and forgotten laws of medieval Europe. Forget everything you think you know about weird medieval rules. This one is stranger than banning dancing, weirder than outlawing cats, and more ridiculous than the law against wearing purple. We're talking about the time when eating a simple, slimy fish could land you in the stocks, bankrupt your family, or even get you excommunicated from the church. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video if you're ready to discover how a wiggling river snake became the center of medieval politics, religion, and underground crime. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what's the strangest food law in your country today. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack that's definitely not eel, and let's journey back to a time when your dinner could literally determine your fate. Number 1. The river full of eels. Picture this, you're standing on the banks of a medieval European river in the year 1347. The water is murky, probably filled with things you'd rather not think about, but something else catches your eye. The river is moving. Not just flowing, but writhing, twisting, alive with thousands upon thousands of slippery, serpentine creatures slithering through the water like living ribbons of silver and black. Welcome to medieval Europe, where rivers weren't just waterways. They were grocery stores. And the most valuable item on the menu? Eels. These weren't your modern, overfished streams. Medieval rivers were absolutely packed with European eels. The Thames, the Rhine, the Seine, every major waterway from England to Germany was teeming with them. Fishermen would lower their nets and pull up writhing masses of eels so thick they could barely lift them. Children would catch them with their bare hands. Entire families would wade into rivers during eel season and emerge with baskets full of their slippery prizes. But why eels? Why not salmon or trout or any other fish? Well, eels were different. They were everywhere, they were easy to catch, and most importantly, they could survive for days out of water. In a world without refrigeration, that meant everything. You could catch an eel on Monday, it would still be fresh on Thursday. Try that with a salmon, and you'd be eating rotten fish soup. The abundance was staggering. Medieval records from London show that during peak eel season, the Thames was so thick with them that you could supposedly walk across the river on their backs. Monastery accounts from the 13th century describe monks hauling in over 60,000 eels in a single day. That's not a typo. 60,000 eels from one stretch of river. For the poor, eels were survival. A peasant family could feed themselves for weeks on a single good day of eel fishing. The fish were fatty, nutritious, and filled your belly when grain was scarce and meat was impossible to afford. Eel pie became the bread and butter of the lower classes. Literally, they'd wrap eels in pastry, bake them over coal fires, and have a meal that would last for days. But it wasn't just peasant food. The nobility loved eels too, though they prepared them differently. While the poor ate eel pie, the rich had eel jellied in wine, eel roasted with expensive spices, eel stuffed with herbs and served at grand feasts. King Henry I of England was said to have died from eating too many lampreys, which are eel-like fish. That's right, a king literally ate himself to death on eels. The church got involved too. Monks and nuns needed protein during their many fasting periods, and eels were considered acceptable because they came from water, not land. Monasteries built elaborate eel traps called eel weirs. These were underwater mazes that funneled eels into holding ponds where they could be harvested as needed. Some monasteries became incredibly wealthy just from selling eels. By the 14th century, eels weren't just food. They were a cornerstone of European economics. Entire towns built their economies around eel fishing. Markets specialized in nothing but eel sales. Trade routes developed specifically for transporting live eels from river towns to inland cities. But here's where our story takes a dark turn. Because when something becomes that valuable, that's central to daily life, people get greedy. And when people get greedy with nature, nature starts to fight back. Those rivers full of eels, they wouldn't stay full forever. And when the eels started disappearing, the medieval world would create laws so bizarre, so desperate, that they seem almost impossible to believe. The eel was about to become medieval Europe's most controversial fish. And the laws that followed would turn ordinary people into criminals, create underground markets, and prove that in the Middle Ages, even your dinner was political. Number 2. Eels as currency. You walk into a medieval tax office in 1290. Not that it looks like a modern office, mind you. It's probably just a wooden table in the corner of the Lord Hall, covered with parchment, ink stains, and the desperate hopes of peasants trying not to get their hands chopped off for unpaid debts. The tax collector, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the personality of moldy cheese, looks up at you expectantly. You reach into your sack and pull out your payment for this year's rent. Not coins, not grain, not even chickens. Eels. Live, squirming, slippery eels. Welcome to the medieval economy, where fish could pay your taxes and rent your land. This isn't a joke. In medieval England, eels were literally legal tender for certain transactions. The Domesday Book, that great census of Norman England from 1086, lists thousands of properties where rent was paid in eels. Not eel-equivalent money. Actual eels. The Abbey of Peterborough received over 60,000 eels annually from its tenants. The town of Wisbech paid 14,000 eels per year to their lord. Entire villages would organize their year around catching enough eels to pay their obligations. But why would anyone accept slimy fish as payment? Simple. Eels were more reliable than money. Medieval coins were constantly being debased, clipped, or counterfeited. The silver content kept changing. Exchange rates fluctuated wildly. But an eel was an eel. You could see it, smell it, and know exactly what you were getting. And eels had something medieval money often lacked: intrinsic value. You couldn't eat a silver coin when you were starving, but you could always eat an eel. During famines, when grain prices skyrocketed and livestock died, eels maintained their worth because they were both currency and food. The system was surprisingly sophisticated. Different sizes of eels had different values. Young eels, called elvers, were worth less than adult eels. Large, mature eels were premium currency. There were official eel measurers, just like there were official grain measurers. Markets had standardized eel baskets to ensure fair trades. Some regions even had eel banks, where live eels were stored in ponds until needed for payment. The church was deeply involved in the eel economy. Monasteries didn't just accept eel tithes, they actively promoted the system. Why? Because eels could be stored alive for long periods, unlike other forms of payment that spoiled quickly. A monastery could collect eel payments throughout the year, keep them in specially built eel ponds, and have a steady supply of protein for their fasting days. But the system created some bizarre situations. Imagine being a medieval lawyer trying to collect on a debt. Sir William owes the monastery 57 large eels and 12 elvers for last winter's grain loan. How do you calculate interest on eels? What happens if some of the eels die before payment is due? Medieval court records are filled with disputes over eel quality, eel sizes, and whether a partially decomposed eel still counts as legal payment. The eel economy even influenced international relations. Trade agreements between England and France included specific clauses about eel tariffs. Diplomatic gifts often included shipments of the finest eels. When King John wanted to curry favor with the Pope, he sent a gift of premium English eels preserved in wine. Women played a crucial role in the eel economy too. While men might go out on fishing boats, women controlled the eel markets. They decided which eels were worth keeping, which should be sold immediately, and which could be stored for higher prices later. The eelwives of London's Billingsgate Market were legendary for their sharp business sense and their ability to spot a bad eel from 50 feet away. But this system created a problem. When something becomes currency, people start hoarding it. And when people start hoarding a natural resource, that resource becomes scarce. Medieval lords began stockpiling eels not just for food, but as investments. Monasteries started competing with each other for the best eel territories. Entire river systems became privatized, with armed guards protecting the most productive eel grounds. The eel was no longer just dinner. It was wealth, power, and security all rolled into one slippery package. And just like any valuable commodity, people would soon be willing to fight, steal, and die for it. The stage was being set for one of medieval Europe's strangest conflicts, the Great Eel Wars. Number 3. The problem with too many eels. By 1320, medieval Europe had discovered something that modern environmentalists know all too well. When everybody wants the same thing, that thing doesn't last very long. You're standing by the same river we visited earlier, but something's different. The water isn't writhing anymore. The silver ribbons of eels have thinned to scattered individuals. Where fishermen once pulled up nets bursting with eels, they now haul in mostly empty rope. The children who used to catch eels with their bare hands come home with muddy fingers and disappointed faces. Medieval Europe had eaten its way through the eel population. The signs had been there for decades, but nobody wanted to pay attention. Fishermen started having to venture further upstream to find good catches. The eels they did catch were getting smaller. Market prices began to rise steadily. What had once been poor people's food was becoming a luxury item. But instead of scaling back, medieval society doubled down. If eels were getting scarce, that just made them more valuable. More people entered the eel fishing business. New techniques were developed to catch every last eel in a river stretch. Eel weirs became more elaborate, designed to trap even the smallest elvers before they could grow to breeding age. The church made everything worse. As eel prices rose, monasteries saw an opportunity. They began investing heavily in eel fishing operations, building massive weirs that could strip entire river sections bare. The Abbey of Ramsey built an eel were so large and effective that it reportedly caught over 100,000 eels in a single season. Other monasteries competed to build even larger traps. Medieval fishing technology, primitive as it was, became devastatingly efficient through sheer scale and persistence. Fishermen would work in teams, stretching nets across entire rivers. They'd use spears, hooks, baskets, and their bare hands. During spawning season, when eels gathered in huge masses, fishing communities would work around the clock, hauling in everything they could catch. The nobility joined the frenzy too. Lords began claiming exclusive rights to eel fishing in their territories. They hired professional eel fishermen, offered bounties for large catches, and turned eel fishing into an industrial operation. What had once been a casual activity for peasants became a systematic harvesting machine. And then there were the unintended consequences. Eels weren't just food and currency. They were part of the river ecosystem. They ate smaller fish, controlled insect populations, and their movements stirred up river sediments that fed other aquatic life. As eel populations crashed, rivers began to change. Fish that had lived alongside eels for centuries started disappearing too. Water quality declined. The entire aquatic food chain wobbled. Fishermen began reporting strange things. Rivers that had teemed with life became eerily quiet. Other fish species, deprived of their natural predators and competitors, either exploded in population or vanished entirely. Some rivers developed thick mats of algae that had previously been kept in check by eel feeding patterns. The economic effects rippled outward too. Towns that had built their entire economies around eel fishing faced collapse. The famous eel markets of London saw their supplies dwindle from thousands of eels per day to hundreds, then dozens. Prices soared so high that only the wealthy could afford what had once fed the poorest peasants. Desperate fishermen began taking bigger risks. They ventured into deeper, more dangerous waters. They fished during storms and floods. They started poaching eels from private waters, leading to violent conflicts between communities. The Finland region of England saw actual battles between rival eel fishing gangs, complete with weapons, ambushes, and casualties. Some tried to adapt. Fish farmers attempted to breed eels in captivity, but medieval understanding of eel reproduction was essentially zero. They didn't know that eels migrate thousands of miles to spawn, or that the breeding cycle takes years to complete. Most eel farming attempts failed spectacularly, producing nothing but expensive ponds full of dying fish. The scarcity created another problem: fraud. With eels becoming so valuable, dishonest merchants began passing off other fish as eels. They'd skin lampreys and sell them as premium eels. They'd stuff regular fish with eel meat to increase the weight. Some even created fake eels from pig intestines and fish paste. Medieval markets became minefields of eel fraud. By 1340, the eel crisis was undeniable. What had once been Europe's most abundant freshwater fish was becoming rare enough that catching one was noteworthy. The creatures that had fed millions, paid countless rents, and supported entire economies were disappearing into cooking pots faster than they could reproduce. And that's when medieval authorities realized they had to do something drastic. Something unprecedented. Something so strange that people would still be talking about it 700 years later. They had to make it illegal to eat eels. Number 4. Strange church concerns. Picture yourself in a dim stone monastery in 1343. The smell of incense mingles with something else. The aroma of roasted eel drifting from the kitchen. Brother Thomas, a round-faced monk with permanently stained fingers from copying manuscripts, catches the scent and immediately drops to his knees in prayer. Not in gratitude for the meal, mind you. In panic. Because Brother Thomas has just committed what his abbot considers a grave spiritual error. He has been tempted by the smell of eel on a fasting day. Welcome to the medieval church's complicated relationship with eels, where slippery fish became a theological nightmare. The problem started innocently enough. Medieval Christianity had strict rules about fasting. During Lent on Fridays and during various saints' days, Christians were forbidden from eating meat. But fish was allowed. The reasoning was simple. Fish came from water, not land, so they weren't technically meat in the biblical sense. This should have made eels perfect fasting food. They were fish, they were nutritious, and they were widely available. For centuries, monasteries had relied on eels to feed their monks during the many fasting periods that dotted the medieval calendar. Eel pie on Friday became as traditional as Sunday Mass. But then eels became too good at their job. The first complaints came from strict monasteries where monks were supposed to practice complete self-denial during fasting periods. The problem? Eels were delicious. Really delicious. Medieval cooks had perfected dozens of ways to prepare them. Eel in wine sauce, jellied eel, eel pie with herbs, smoked eel with spices. What was supposed to be bland, penitential food had become gourmet cuisine. Brother Augustine of Canterbury wrote in 1298, "The eel has become a stumbling block to proper fasting. Our brothers look forward to Friday meals with unseemly enthusiasm. How can we practice self-denial when our fish taste better than the finest meat?" The church hierarchy was genuinely confused. They had created rules to ensure spiritual discipline, but eels were undermining the entire system. Monks were gaining weight during Lent. Some monasteries reported that their eel feasts were more elaborate than their Easter celebrations. The point of fasting was to suffer a little for spiritual growth, but eel-based fasting felt more like a reward. Some bishops tried to solve the problem by reclassifying eels. In 1342, the Bishop of Winchester declared that eels were too flavorful for proper fasting and should be treated like meat during penitential periods. This created immediate chaos. Were eels fish or meat? Could you eat them on Friday or not? Different regions gave different answers. The theological debates became genuinely weird. Scholars at the University of Paris spent months arguing about the spiritual properties of eel fat. Was it sinful to enjoy your fasting food too much? Could a monk be excommunicated for savoring his eel pie? One treatise from the period seriously discussed whether the slippery texture of eels made them inherently sinful. But the real problem was deeper than theology. It was about class and economics. The church's wealthiest monasteries could afford the finest eels, prepared by skilled cooks with expensive spices. Their fasting meals were more luxurious than what most peasants ate on feast days. Meanwhile, poor parish priests made do with whatever scraps they could find. This created a scandal. How could rich monks claim to be practicing Christian self-denial while feasting on gourmet eel dishes? How could the church preach humility while its abbeys served meals that kings would envy? The eel had become a symbol of religious hypocrisy. Some monastic orders tried to ban eels entirely. The Cistercians, known for their strict lifestyle, declared that their monks could only eat the cheapest, most poorly prepared eels, and only in minimal quantities. The Benedictines tried to limit eel consumption to specific days. The Franciscans, true to their vows of poverty, were forbidden from eating any eel that cost more than a penny. But these rules created new problems. Monastery cooks became experts at hiding good eels in bad preparations. They'd take premium eels, cook them poorly on purpose, and then secretly improve them with concealed seasonings. Medieval monasteries developed an entire underground cuisine of disguised eels, designed to fool the abbots. The church also worried about the broader spiritual implications of the eel trade. If eels were becoming too valuable, too precious, too fought over, were Christians developing an unhealthy attachment to worldly goods? Some priests began preaching that excessive eel consumption was a form of gluttony, even during permitted eating periods. Local parishes reported strange confessions. Parishioners admitted to eel envy, coveting their neighbor's catch. Others confessed to eel pride, boasting about the size of their eels. Some even admitted to eel wrath, getting angry when their eel traps came up empty. The 7 deadly sins, it seemed, all had eel-related variations. The theological confusion reached its peak when some church scholars began arguing that eels were inherently problematic because they were too closely associated with serpents. In medieval thinking, snakes were linked to Satan and original sin. Eels looked like snakes, moved like snakes, and lived in murky water like the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Maybe some argued Christians shouldn't be eating them at all. This snake theory gained surprising traction. Several dioceses issued warnings about the serpentine nature of eels. Some priests refused to bless eel catches. A few monasteries actually banned eels not for being too tasty, but for being too snake-like. By 1344, the church's relationship with eels had become a complete mess. Different regions had different rules. Some monasteries served elaborate eel feasts while others banned eels entirely. Parish priests gave contradictory advice about whether eels were spiritually safe to eat. And then the secular authorities looked at this religious chaos and decided the church had the right idea, just for the wrong reasons. If eels were causing spiritual problems, and economic problems, and social problems, maybe the solution wasn't theological. Maybe the solution was legal. Number 5. Eels and superstition. You're walking through a medieval marketplace in 1351, and something catches your eye at the herbalist stall. Between the dried herbs and mysterious powders, you spot something unexpected, a collection of small vials filled with what looks like thick, dark oil. The toothless old woman running the stall notices your interest and leans forward conspiratorially. "Eel oil," she whispers, as if sharing the secret to eternal life. "Cures deafness, grows back hair, and protects against witches. Only 3 silver coins. Welcome to medieval Europe's thriving trade in eel magic, where slimy fish were believed to possess powers that would make modern medicine jealous." The supernatural reputation of eels went far beyond their economic value. To medieval minds, eels were fundamentally mysterious creatures. They appeared from nowhere, disappeared without explanation, could survive out of water longer than seemed natural, and moved in ways that defied easy understanding. In a world where unexplained phenomena were automatically attributed to magic, eels were obviously supernatural. The mystery started with basic eel biology, which medieval people completely misunderstood. Nobody knew where eels came from. Unlike other fish, eels didn't seem to have obvious breeding cycles. There were no eel eggs, no baby eels in the rivers during certain seasons, no clear spawning behavior. Adult eels would simply vanish from rivers periodically, then new eels would appear as if from thin air. Medieval scholars developed dozens of theories about eel reproduction, each more fantastical than the last. Some believed eels were born from mud and decaying matter, spontaneously generated by river slime. Others thought they fell from the sky during thunderstorms. A popular theory claimed that eels were created when horsehairs fell into water and magically transformed into living creatures. This mysterious origin made eels perfect magical ingredients. If they could spontaneously generate from nothing, surely they possessed creative power that could be harnessed. Medieval grimoires are filled with eel-based spells and potions. Eel blood was used in love potions, supposedly because eels could create life from emptiness. Eel skin was worn as protection against evil spirits, because creatures that can materialize from nowhere must have divine or demonic connections. The most valuable magical component was eel oil, extracted by slowly cooking eels and collecting the fat that rendered out. This oil was believed to cure almost everything. Medieval medical texts prescribed eel oil for deafness, blindness, joint pain, skin diseases, and impotence. Some claimed it could restore youth, enhance intelligence, or grant the ability to see the future. The demand for medicinal eel oil was enormous. Apothecaries in major cities would pay premium prices for eels specifically intended for oil production. The finest oils came from the largest, oldest eels, which were thought to contain the most concentrated magical properties. Some eel oils were aged for years, like expensive wines, and sold for prices that could feed a family for months. Eel bones had their own magical uses. Ground into powder, they were mixed into medicines for broken bones, supposedly because the flexible spine of an eel could transfer its bendability to human injuries. Eel vertebrae were strung into necklaces that were believed to prevent back pain. Some parents would tie eel bones around their children's necks to ensure flexible growth. The skin of eels became valuable too. Eel leather was prized not just for its durability, but for its supposed protective qualities. Medieval warriors would sometimes line their armor with eel skin, believing it would make them harder to catch or wound. Merchants carried purses made from eel skin to prevent theft, convinced that the slippery nature of the material would confuse pickpockets. Even eel heads had magical applications. Dried eel heads were hung in houses to ward off lightning, based on the belief that eels could control water and electricity. Some farmers buried eel heads in their fields to ensure good crops, thinking the mysterious life-generating power of eels would transfer to their plants. But the strangest eel superstition involved their supposed connection to the spirit world. Because eels lived in murky water and could survive in conditions that killed other fish, many believed they were messengers between the world of the living and the dead. Some medieval necromancers claimed they could use live eels to communicate with spirits, dropping them into sacred pools and interpreting their movements as messages from beyond. This spiritual connection made eels valuable in funeral rites. Wealthy families would sometimes bury small eels with their dead, believing the creatures would guide souls through the watery passages of the afterlife. Some graveyards had special eel ponds where mourners could release eels as offerings to ensure their loved one's safe journey to heaven. The church tried to combat eel superstitions, but with limited success. Official doctrine held that eels were just fish, created by God like any other creature. But local priests often found their congregations more interested in eel magic than Christian theology. Some priests gave up and incorporated eel beliefs into their sermons, claiming that the mysterious nature of eels was proof of God's infinite creativity. Women, in particular, were associated with eel magic. Medieval society believed that women had natural connections to mysterious forces, and eel-based remedies were often the domain of female healers. Wise women in villages across Europe specialized in eel potions, eel charms, and eel divination. They would read fortunes by observing eel behavior, predict weather patterns based on eel migrations, and create love charms from eel scales. The magical reputation of eels created another layer of demand that strained the already depleted populations. People weren't just eating eels and using them as currency. They were also catching them for supernatural purposes. Magic-quality eels, especially large or unusually marked specimens, could sell for even more than food-quality eels. By the 1340s, the eel had become medieval Europe's most mystical creature. They were food, money, medicine, and magic all rolled into one slippery package. Every part of their bodies had value, from their oil to their bones to their skin. They were connected to love, war, health, death, and the afterlife. And that made them incredibly dangerous. Because when people believe something has magical power, they'll do almost anything to get it. The stage was set for the kind of desperate behavior that would force governments to step in and try to control what had become medieval Europe's most coveted and mysterious creature. The laws that followed would be unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Number 6. The law arrives. The year is 1354. You're a town clerk in Gloucester, England, holding a quill that's shaking in your hand because you're about to write down the most ridiculous law you've ever heard. The mayor, a red-faced man who clearly ate too many eel pies in his youth, is pacing back and forth, dictating words that sound like they came from a fever dream. Be it known, he declares, that from the feast of St. Michael until the feast of St. Thomas, no person of any station shall take, sell, buy, or consume eels within the bounds of this township, under penalty of fine, imprisonment, or public shame. You pause, quill dripping ink. Sir, did you say eels? Eels, he roars. The slippery devils that are ruining our rivers and corrupting our souls. Welcome to one of the strangest moments in legal history, the day medieval governments decided to outlaw eating fish. The first eel bans appeared almost simultaneously across Europe in the mid-14th century, as if rulers had all collectively lost their minds at the same time. But there was method to the madness. Local authorities had watched their economies crumble as eel populations crashed. They'd seen religious communities torn apart by arguments over fish. They'd witnessed desperate people fighting over the last eels in their rivers. Something had to be done, and medieval governments only knew one way to solve problems: make them illegal. The laws varied wildly from place to place, but they all shared a common absurdity. In London, the ban applied only to eels longer than 12 inches, creating a bizarre situation where fishmongers would publicly measure eels to determine if they were legal. In Paris, the ban covered all eels except those caught by licensed monasteries, leading to a thriving trade in fake monastery credentials. Some regions got creative with their restrictions. The German city of Cologne banned eel fishing on Sundays, Mondays, and any day when the cathedral bells rang more than 7 times. The Italian city-state of Venice prohibited the sale of live eels within 50 yards of any church, forcing eel merchants to conduct business in back alleys like drug dealers. The most comprehensive ban came from the English crown in 1357. King Edward III, dealing with multiple crises including the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, somehow found time to declare a nationwide moratorium on eel consumption during the months of September, October, and November. The royal proclamation was read in every town square, posted on every church door, and enforced by royal sheriffs who probably wondered what they'd done wrong in their careers to end up policing fish consumption. The reasoning behind these laws was a confused mixture of environmental concern, economic desperation, and religious panic. Official documents cited the need to preserve the eel for future generations and prevent the moral corruption associated with excessive eel consumption. Some laws explicitly mentioned the need to stop eel riots and eel-related violence, but enforcing these laws proved nearly impossible. How do you police what people eat in their own homes? Medieval governments had limited bureaucratic capacity and virtually no surveillance systems. They could control what was sold in public markets, but they couldn't monitor every kitchen, every private meal, every secret eel consumption. The laws created immediate practical problems. What counted as an eel? Lampreys looked similar. So did some water snakes. Medieval people weren't taxonomists. They called lots of long, slimy creatures eels. Suddenly, legal authorities had to become fish experts, determining whether a particular creature fell under the eel ban or not. Enforcement became farcical. Town guards found themselves inspecting stew pots, sniffing around kitchens, and interrogating families about their dinner plans. Court records from the period are filled with cases like the Crown versus Margaret the Baker, accused of serving eel pie during the prohibited season, and John the Fisherman versus the town council regarding the legal status of lamprey stew. The penalties for violation were often harsh but inconsistently applied. Some regions imposed heavy fines. Others used public humiliation. The town of Canterbury developed a particularly creative punishment. Eel offenders were forced to stand in the public square, wearing a necklace of dried fish while townspeople threw vegetables at them. But the most problematic aspect of the eel laws was their class-based enforcement. Wealthy nobles could afford to pay the fines, or they had enough political connections to avoid prosecution entirely. Poor people who depended on eels for basic nutrition faced the full weight of the law. Medieval justice had always been biased toward the rich, but eel laws made the inequality especially obvious. The church's response to the secular eel laws was mixed. Some religious authorities supported the bans, seeing them as reinforcement of their theological concerns about eel consumption. Others opposed them, arguing that the government had no right to regulate what Christians ate during properly designated eating periods. Several bishops issued proclamations declaring that religious law superseded secular law when it came to food consumption. This created a legal nightmare. Were eels illegal under secular law, but permitted under religious law? Could a person be prosecuted by civil authorities for doing something their priest said was acceptable? Some regions saw actual conflicts between church and state officials over eel-related arrests. The international implications were equally messy. Trade in eels had been a significant part of medieval commerce. English eels were exported to France, German eels went to Italy, and Scandinavian eels were shipped all over northern Europe. When some regions banned eel consumption while others didn't, it created a patchwork of legal confusion that made international trade almost impossible. Diplomatic relations suffered. The French ambassador to England formally complained that English eel laws were disrupting French commerce. The Holy Roman Emperor received petitions from German merchants who claimed they were losing fortunes because their eel shipments were being confiscated at various borders. By 1358, just 4 years after the first major eel bans, it was clear that the laws were creating more problems than they solved. Instead of preserving eel populations, they had driven the trade underground. Instead of reducing social tensions, they had created new forms of class conflict. Instead of simplifying medieval life, they had added layers of bureaucratic complexity that nobody fully understood. But it was too late to simply repeal the laws. Too much political capital had been invested in them. Too many officials had built their careers on eel enforcement. Too many interest groups had formed around supporting or opposing the bans. The eel laws had taken on a life of their own, and like the eels themselves, they would prove very difficult to catch and control. Number 7. The black market of eels. You're creeping through the back alleys of medieval London at midnight, clutching a leather pouch that contains something more valuable than gold, more dangerous than stolen church relics, and more illegal than harboring enemy spies. Inside your pouch are 3 live eels, and if you're caught with them during the ban season, you could lose everything you own. Welcome to medieval Europe's most ridiculous criminal enterprise, eel smuggling. The moment governments banned eel consumption, they They accidentally created one of the most profitable black markets in medieval history. And like all prohibition efforts, the laws didn't eliminate demand. They just drove it underground and made it incredibly expensive. Within months of the first eel bans, organized smuggling networks appeared across Europe. These weren't amateur operations run by desperate fishermen. They were sophisticated criminal enterprises with established routes, coded communications, and corrupt officials on their payroll. The Italian eel smuggling rings were said to rival the Silk Road in their organizational complexity. The profits were astronomical. An eel that sold for 1 silver coin in legal season could fetch 10 silver coins on the black market during the ban months. Premium eels, especially large specimens suitable for magical purposes, commanded prices that exceeded the annual wages of skilled craftsmen. Some criminal organizations made so much money from eel smuggling that they abandoned their previous illegal activities entirely. Smuggling routes developed along traditional trade paths, but with elaborate precautions. Eel runners would transport their cargo in false-bond wagons, hidden compartments in boats, and even concealed pockets sewn into religious robes. Some smugglers disguised eels as other products, wrapping them in cloth and claiming they were bolts of fabric or religious relics being transported between monasteries. The most successful smuggling operations specialized in live eel transport, which was incredibly difficult but highly profitable. Live eels could be sold at premium prices because medieval people believed fresh eel oil and blood had stronger magical properties than preserved versions. Smugglers developed ingenious methods for keeping eels alive during transport, specially ventilated boxes, portable water tanks, and even trained assistants whose only job was to monitor eel health during long journeys. The black market created its own vocabulary. Silver swimmers meant premium live eels. Snake oil referred to any eel-based product. Going fishing was code for conducting an illegal eel transaction. Buyers and sellers used elaborate hand signals and passwords to identify each other. Some criminal organizations developed their own brands, marking their eels with distinctive cuts or dyes to guarantee authenticity in a market flooded with fake products. Corrupt officials were essential to the trade. Port authorities could be bribed to ignore suspicious cargo. Town guards would conveniently be elsewhere when smuggling operations took place. Even some judges accepted eel-based bribes, creating a circular system where the profits from illegal eel sales were used to ensure the trade could continue. Court records suggest that some regions had more officials taking eel bribes than officials actually enforcing eel laws. The church became an unwitting partner in eel smuggling. Because many monasteries had exemptions from eel laws, criminal organizations began forging religious credentials. Fake monks appeared throughout Europe, complete with forged documents claiming they were transporting eels for legitimate religious purposes. Some actual monks became smugglers themselves, using their religious immunity to run eel trafficking operations that would make modern drug cartels jealous. Women played crucial roles in the eel black market, often as the final link between smugglers and consumers. Medieval society allowed women to run food stalls in small markets with less official oversight than larger, male-dominated businesses. Female eel dealers would receive smuggled eels and distribute them through networks of loyal customers. These women developed elaborate systems of coded communications, using seemingly innocent conversations about recipes and cooking techniques to arrange illegal eel sales. The smuggling networks also spawned violence. Different criminal organizations fought over territory, supply routes, and customer bases. Medieval court records document eel-related murders, kidnappings, and armed robberies. The city of Bruges experienced what historians now call the Eel Wars of 1359 to 1361, a series of violent conflicts between competing smuggling gangs that left dozens dead and required royal intervention to resolve. But perhaps the strangest aspect of the eel black market was how it affected legitimate businesses. Restaurants and taverns that had built their reputations on eel dishes faced a choice: go out of business, find substitute ingredients that disappointed their customers, or secretly purchase black market eels at prices that destroyed their profit margins. Many establishments tried to create fake eel dishes using other fish, leading to a secondary market in eel imposters. The medical trade was hit especially hard. Apothecaries and healers who had relied on eel-based remedies suddenly found themselves either breaking the law or unable to treat their patients. Some turned to the black market, paying enormous sums for medicinal quality eels. Others tried to develop substitute treatments, leading to a bizarre period of medical experimentation where doctors tested everything from snake oil to pig fat as eel replacements. International smuggling became a diplomatic crisis. English eel smugglers would cross the channel to buy French eels, then smuggle them back into England where they could be sold at huge profits. French authorities complained that English criminals were depleting French eel supplies. English authorities complained that French smugglers were corrupting English markets. Several minor wars nearly started over eel-related trade disputes. The most sophisticated smuggling operations developed early forms of insurance and banking. Because eel shipments could spoil, be confiscated, or be stolen by rival gangs, criminal organizations began offering insurance policies to protect investors. Some groups created eel banks, where customers could deposit eels during legal seasons and withdraw them during ban periods, paying interest in the form of additional eels. By 1360, the eel black market had become so large and profitable that it was affecting entire regional economies. Some towns became known as eel smuggling centers, with most of the population involved either directly or indirectly in the illegal trade. Tax revenues declined as legitimate eel commerce disappeared and was replaced by untaxed criminal activity. The irony was that the black market made eel depletion worse, not better. Instead of reducing eel consumption, the laws had made eels so valuable that criminal organizations began systematic overfishing to meet black market demand. Rivers that might have recovered under sensible conservation measures were stripped bare by smugglers who had no incentive to preserve future eel populations. Medieval authorities found themselves in an impossible position. Every attempt to strengthen eel laws created more criminal opportunities. Every successful bust of a smuggling operation just drove up black market prices and attracted more criminals to the trade. The cure had become worse than the disease, and there seemed to be no way to escape the cycle. Number 8. Punishments for eating eels. You're standing in the town square of medieval Chester in 1361, watching something that your grandchildren will never believe actually happened. A man named William the baker is locked in wooden stocks, his head and hands trapped between heavy planks, while angry townspeople pelt him with rotten vegetables and chunks of stale bread. His crime? He was caught eating eel pie. Medieval punishments for eel consumption ranged from the absurd to the genuinely brutal, creating a system of justice so bizarre that it seemed like something from a fever dream rather than actual law enforcement. The most common punishment was financial. Eel law violations typically carried fines that were calculated based on the amount of eel consumed, the quality of the eel, and the social status of the offender. A peasant caught with a small eel might pay a fine equivalent to a week's wages. A merchant caught with premium eel could face fines that bankrupted their entire family. But medieval authorities quickly discovered that many eel offenders couldn't pay the fines. Poor people who turned to eel consumption out of desperation obviously didn't have silver coins lying around to pay penalties. This led to the development of alternative punishments that were often more creative than effective. Public humiliation became the preferred punishment for eel crimes. Offenders were forced to wear signs identifying their crime, sometimes for weeks at a time. These signs became increasingly elaborate and mocking. Simple placards reading "Eel Eater" evolve into detailed descriptions like, "This man violated God's law and the king's law by consuming the forbidden fish on the feast day of St. Agnes while pretending to fast." Some towns developed specialized eel-related punishments that became local traditions. The city of York created the Eel Walk, where offenders had to parade through the streets carrying a large dead fish while criers announced their crime to anyone within hearing distance. The town of Bristol forced eel criminals to spend a full day at the fish market, publicly cleaning and gutting fish while explaining their crimes to anyone who would listen. Physical punishments were less common, but more memorable. Some regions used traditional medieval penalties like time in the stocks or pillory, but with eel-specific modifications. Offenders might be forced to wear necklaces made of dried eel bones, or have their hands stained with eel oil that wouldn't wash off for weeks. These markings served as both punishment and warning, identifying the person as an eel criminal long after their formal sentence had ended. The most creative punishments involved forced consumption of unappetizing fish. Courts would sentence eel eaters to consume large quantities of the cheapest, most unpleasant fish available, usually spoiled herring or rotten cod. The logic was that if someone had developed an unhealthy attachment to premium eels, they needed to learn to appreciate less desirable alternatives. Religious penalties became common as the church got more involved in eel law enforcement. Offenders might be required to perform extended penances, make pilgrimages to specific shrines, or fast for longer periods than usual. Some were banned from taking communion for months, effectively cutting them off from their spiritual community. A few extreme cases resulted in temporary excommunication, making the offender a social outcast until they had properly atoned. But the punishment system created massive inequalities based on social class. Wealthy nobles who violated eel laws could usually negotiate reduced penalties, substitute fines for physical punishment, or simply use their political connections to avoid prosecution entirely. Court records show numerous cases where rich offenders paid modest fines for eel crimes that would have resulted in severe punishment for poor people. The most notorious case involved Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a wealthy landowner who was caught hosting an elaborate feast featuring dozens of premium eels during the height of the band season. His punishment? A fine equivalent to what he probably spent on wine for the same dinner. Meanwhile, a peasant woman named Margaret Miller received 3 days in the stocks for feeding eel scraps to her starving children. Enforcement became increasingly arbitrary and corrupt. Some officials used eel laws as pretext to settle personal scores or extract bribes. Others ignored violations by people they liked while strictly prosecuting those they disliked. The city of Canterbury had to dismiss its entire eel enforcement staff after they were caught running their own eel smuggling operation while prosecuting their competitors. Women faced particular challenges under eel punishment systems. Female offenders were often accused of using eels for witchcraft or love potions, which carried much more severe penalties than simple consumption violations. Some women were subjected to additional humiliations, like being forced to confess their crimes during church services or having their hair cut off as a mark of shame. Children presented another problem for medieval justice systems. What do you do with a 10-year-old caught eating eel? Some regions held parents responsible for their children's eel crimes, leading to situations where entire families were punished for one-child violation. Other areas developed separate juvenile eel courts, creating a specialized legal system just for underage fish consumption. The most extreme punishments were reserved for repeat offenders and professional eel criminals. Chronic violators could face banishment from their towns, confiscation of all their property, or even branding with hot irons. Some regions developed 3 strikes laws where third-time eel offenders faced life imprisonment or execution. But perhaps the strangest aspect of eel punishment was how it affected family relationships. Spouses could be required to testify against each other in eel cases. Children were sometimes forced to report their parents to legal eel consumption. Extended families could be split apart when some members violated eel laws and others refused to support them. The legal system became so focused on eel crimes that other forms of justice suffered. Courts spent enormous amounts of time and resources prosecuting fish violations while serious crimes like assault, theft, and fraud received less attention. Some regions had more judges specializing in eel law than judges, handling all other crimes combined. Prison systems weren't equipped to handle the volume of eel criminals. Medieval jails were small, primitive, and expensive to operate. When eel laws created hundreds of new prisoners, authorities had to develop alternatives like work gangs, public service requirements, and early release programs. Some prisoners worked off their sentences by building new fish markets or repairing river walls. The psychological effects of eel punishment were often worse than the physical penalties. Being publicly shamed for eating fish created lasting social stigma. Some offenders never recovered their reputations, even after completing their sentences. Families moved to different towns to escape the shame of eel-related convictions. By 1365, the punishment system had become so complex and contradictory that legal experts struggled to understand it. Different towns had different penalties for identical crimes. The same violation could result in a small fine or severe physical punishment depending on which court handled the case. Justice had become a lottery where eel eaters never knew what consequences they might face. Number 9. Why eels, not other fish? You're a medieval town councillor in 1363, sitting at a rough wooden table covered with parchment, ink stains, and the mounting frustration of trying to govern people who seem determined to make your life difficult. Your colleague, a thin man with permanently worried eyes, slams his fist on the table. Why, he shouts, are we not banning salmon? Or trout? Or any other fish? Why does everyone care so much about these slippery, snake-like creatures that we've had to turn our entire legal system upside down? It's a reasonable question, and the answer reveals something fundamental about medieval society's relationship with nature, economics, and power. Eels weren't just another fish. They were the fish that mattered, and they mattered for reasons that made them irreplaceable in medieval life. First, eels were uniquely practical. Unlike salmon, which had specific spawning seasons, or trout, which required clean, cold water, eels were available year-round in almost every water source. They lived in rivers, streams, ponds, and even muddy ditches. A peasant family could catch eels in spring, summer, fall, and winter. No other fish provided such consistent availability. Eels also had unmatched durability. While most fish died within hours of being caught, eels could survive for days or even weeks out of water if kept in damp conditions. This made them perfect for medieval food storage and transport. You couldn't ship fresh salmon from London to Paris in 1350, but you could definitely ship live eels. This durability made eels the only fish suitable for long-distance trade and large-scale commerce. The economic infrastructure was built around eels in ways that didn't exist for other fish. Eel weirs, those elaborate underwater traps, represented enormous investments of time, labor, and resources. Monasteries had spent generations perfecting their eel farming techniques. Entire towns had organized their economies around eel markets. You couldn't just substitute trout for eels without rebuilding the entire commercial system. Eels were also uniquely valuable as currency, precisely because they were standardized and recognizable. A salmon could vary enormously in size, quality, and condition. But eels fell into predictable categories: small, medium, large, and premium. Medieval people could assess eel value at a glance, making them perfect for use as money. Other fish were too variable to serve as reliable currency. The medical and magical properties attributed to eels were also unique. While other fish might be used in folk remedies, eels were believed to possess special powers related to their mysterious reproduction and snake-like appearance. Salmon oil wasn't thought to cure deafness. Trout bones weren't considered magical. Only eels had the full range of supernatural associations that made them valuable beyond their nutritional content. But perhaps most importantly, eels occupied a unique ecological niche that made them irreplaceable in medieval diets. They were one of the few fish that were both widely available and sufficiently fatty to provide serious nutrition. Medieval people lived physically demanding lives and needed calorie-dense foods. Most river fish were too lean to serve as dietary staples. Eels were rich, fatty, and filling in ways that other freshwater fish weren't. The religious significance of eels was also special. While all fish were technically acceptable during fasting periods, eels had become culturally associated with religious observance in ways that other fish hadn't. Monastery cookbooks featured dozens of eel recipes, but relatively few recipes for other fish. Religious communities had invested centuries in developing eel-based cuisine for their fasting periods. Social status was tied to eel consumption in ways that didn't apply to other fish. While anyone could catch a trout, the finest eels required specialized knowledge, equipment, and connections. Premium eels became symbols of wealth and sophistication. Serving elaborate eel dishes demonstrated both prosperity and cultural refinement. Other fish, no matter how well prepared, didn't carry the same social significance. The scarcity factor was unique to eels as well. While salmon populations might fluctuate, and trout might be scarce in some regions, eels have been universally abundant throughout Europe for centuries. When eel populations crashed, it represented a fundamentally different kind of crisis than the decline of any other fish species. It was like suddenly running out of wheat or losing all the cattle. Eels weren't just becoming rare. They were disappearing from ecosystems where they had been the dominant species. The international trade implications were also specific to eels. Medieval Europe had developed complex trade relationships based on eel commerce. English eels were exported to France, German eels went to Italy, and Scandinavian eels supplied markets across northern Europe. No other fish had comparable international economic importance. Losing eels meant disrupting trade relationships that had existed for generations. Eels also had unique cultural associations. In medieval folklore, eels are connected to water spirits, fertility magic, and transformation myths. They appeared in stories, songs, and religious allegories in ways that other fish didn't. The eel wasn't just a food source. It was embedded in the cultural imagination of medieval Europe. The technological investment in eel harvesting was also unprecedented. The elaborate weirs, specialized nets, and eel-specific fishing techniques represented generations of accumulated knowledge and infrastructure. Medieval communities had developed expertise in eel fishing that couldn't easily be transferred to other fish species. Starting over with different fish would have meant abandoning centuries of specialized knowledge. Finally, eels have become symbols of stability and continuity in a chaotic world. Medieval life was uncertain, dangerous, and unpredictable. But eels had always been there, in every river, available to anyone desperate enough to wade into the water and grab them. They represented food security in a way that no other resource did. When eels became unavailable, it challenged fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. This is why medieval authorities banned eels but not salmon, trout, or pike. Eels weren't just another fish. They were the foundation of entire economic, social, and cultural systems. When eel populations collapsed, it created ripple effects that touched every aspect of medieval life. Other fish could be substituted for food, but they couldn't replace eels' roles as currency, medicine, trade goods, religious symbols, and cultural touchstones. The eel bans weren't really about fish conservation. They were desperate attempts to preserve entire ways of life that had been built around one uniquely important species. The laws failed because you can't legislate away economic and ecological reality. But they tried because eels weren't just food. They were civilization, slippery, and snake-like, and absolutely irreplaceable. Number 10. The legacy of the eel ban. You're walking through a modern European city in 2023, stopping at a sushi restaurant where eel is a premium menu item costing more than most people's hourly wage. You probably don't think about medieval law while ordering your onagi roll, but you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to one of history's strangest legal experiments. The medieval eel bans may seem like a bizarre footnote to history, but their legacy shaped European culture, law, and environmental thinking in ways that persist to this day. The immediate aftermath of the eel laws was chaos. By 1370, most regions had quietly abandoned their bans, not through formal repeal, but through simple lack of enforcement. The laws had created more problems than they solved, generated massive corruption, and failed entirely in their goal of preserving eel populations. But the damage was done. The combination of overfishing and legal disruption had permanently altered European river ecosystems. Eel populations never recovered to their medieval levels. The great eel runs that had fed Europe for centuries were gone forever, victims of both environmental destruction and legal incompetence. Rivers that had once teemed with millions of eels became quiet waterways where catching a single eel was noteworthy. The abundance that had seemed infinite to medieval Europeans had vanished within a few generations. But the cultural impact of the eel crisis extended far beyond fish populations. The failed laws became a cautionary tale about government overreach and the unintended consequences of prohibition. Medieval chroniclers wrote extensively about the eel follies, using them as examples of how good intentions could lead to social disaster. The legal precedents set by eel laws influenced environmental legislation for centuries. The idea that governments could regulate resource extraction in the name of conservation was revolutionary in medieval Europe. While the eel laws failed, they established the principle that natural resources weren't unlimited and might require legal protection. Modern environmental law traces its roots partly to these medieval experiments. The concept of fishing seasons, the idea of protecting breeding populations, and the notion that popular foods might need to be restricted for sustainability all emerged from the eel crisis. Today's fishing quotas and conservation restrictions use legal frameworks that were first developed to control eel consumption. The economic lessons were equally important. Medieval Europe learned that creating artificial scarcity through prohibition could be more destructive than allowing natural market forces to operate. The eel black markets demonstrated how legal restrictions could corrupt entire commercial systems and create criminal opportunities. These lessons influenced later approaches to resource management. When potato famines struck Europe in later centuries, authorities were much more cautious about using legal restrictions to control food distribution. The memory of eel law failures made governments more willing to use economic incentives rather than criminal penalties to influence consumption patterns. The religious implications of the eel crisis also had lasting effects. The theological debates over whether eels were appropriate fasting food contributed to broader discussions about the role of pleasure in religious observance. Some scholars argue that the eel controversies helped lay groundwork for later Protestant criticisms of Catholic fasting practices. The social changes were profound as well. The class-based enforcement of eel laws contributed to growing resentment against legal systems that treated rich and poor differently. Some historians see the eel crisis as one of several factors that contributed to later peasant revolts and social upheavals. But perhaps the most important legacy was cultural. The eel bans became part of European folklore, inspiring stories, songs, and proverbs that persisted for generations. As slippery as an eel law became a common expression for legal regulations that were impossible to enforce. Eel justice meant arbitrary or class-biased law enforcement. The memory of the eel crisis also influenced European attitudes toward food regulation. For centuries afterward, European governments were reluctant to restrict food consumption, even when public health concerns might have justified intervention. The specter of the failed eel laws made authorities cautious about any legal intervention in dietary choices. Modern European cuisine still bears traces of the medieval eel crisis. Traditional eel dishes became rare and expensive, transforming from common peasant food into luxury items. The scarcity created by medieval overfishing permanently changed eel's cultural status. Today, eel is associated with fine dining and special occasions rather than everyday meals. The environmental legacy is still visible in European rivers. Many waterways that once supported massive eel populations now require extensive restoration efforts to support even small eel runs. Modern conservation programs spend millions trying to rebuild ecosystems that were destroyed during the medieval eel frenzy. Contemporary fish conservation efforts explicitly reference the medieval eel crisis as an example of how not to manage declining fish populations. Modern fisheries management emphasizes scientific assessment, stakeholder cooperation, and graduated responses, rather than the all-or-nothing approach that characterized medieval eel laws. The eel ban also left its mark on European legal traditions. The principle that laws must be enforceable to be effective became a cornerstone of legal theory. The idea that popular resistance could make laws meaningless influenced later approaches to controversial legislation. Perhaps most remarkably, the medieval eel crisis anticipated many modern environmental challenges. The pattern of resource abundance, overexploitation, attempted regulation, black market development, and ultimate depletion is repeated in contemporary struggles over everything from ivory to bluefin tuna to rare earth minerals. The eel bans demonstrated that environmental problems are never purely environmental. They're always also economic, social, political, and cultural problems that require complex solutions. Medieval authorities tried to solve an ecological crisis with simple legal prohibition and discovered that complex systems don't respond well to simple solutions. Today, as we face global environmental challenges that dwarf the medieval eel crisis, the lessons remain relevant. Resource scarcity creates political pressure for quick fixes. Prohibition can drive problems underground rather than solving them. Enforcement that targets the poor while exempting the wealthy undermines both legal authority and conservation goals. The medieval eel ban represents one of humanity's first attempts to use law to solve an environmental crisis. It failed spectacularly, but it taught lessons that are still relevant today. In our own time of environmental crisis, when governments struggle to balance economic needs with ecological protection, the medieval eel eaters remind us that the relationship between human society and natural resources is always more complicated than it first appears. The slippery fish that once filled European rivers became the center of a legal and social experiment that revealed fundamental truths about human nature, government power, and environmental limits. The eels themselves are mostly gone, but their legacy wriggles through European law, culture, and environmental thinking like a persistent reminder that even the most abundant resources can disappear, and even the most well-intentioned laws can make things worse. In the end, the medieval eel ban teaches us that environmental protection requires more than good intentions and legal authority. It requires understanding complex systems, respecting cultural traditions, and recognizing that human behavior is as slippery and unpredictable as the eels themselves. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see an eel on a menu, you'll remember the medieval peasants and nobles who fought, legislated, and schemed over these mysterious creatures. In a strange way, every eel dish today is a small victory over one of history's most ridiculous laws. The eels won in the end. It just took them 700 years to do it. Today, as we face global environmental challenges that dwarf the medieval eel crisis, the lessons remain relevant. Resource scarcity creates political pressure for quick fixes. Prohibition can drive problems underground rather than solving them. Enforcement that targets the poor while exempting the wealthy undermines both legal authority and conservation goals. The medieval eel ban represents one of humanity's first attempts to use law to solve an environmental crisis. It failed spectacularly, but it taught lessons that are still relevant today. In our own time of environmental crisis, when governments struggle to balance economic needs with ecological protection, the medieval eel eaters remind us that the relationship between human society and natural resources is always more complicated than it first appears. The slippery fish that once filled European rivers became the center of a legal and social experiment that revealed fundamental truths about human nature, government power, and environmental limits. The eels themselves are mostly gone, but their legacy wriggles through European law, culture, and environmental thinking like a persistent reminder that even the most abundant resources can disappear, and even the most well-intentioned laws can make things worse. In the end, the medieval eel ban teaches us that environmental protection requires more than good intentions and legal authority. It requires understanding complex systems, respecting cultural traditions, and recognizing that human behavior is as slippery and unpredictable as the eels themselves. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see an eel on a menu, you'll remember the medieval peasants and nobles who fought, legislated, and schemed over these mysterious creatures. In a strange way, every eel dish today is a small victory over one of history's most ridiculous laws. The eels won in the end. It just took them 700 years to do it. Today, as we face global environmental challenges that dwarf the medieval eel crisis, the lessons remain relevant. Resource scarcity creates political pressure for quick fixes. Prohibition can drive problems underground rather than solving them. Enforcement that targets the poor while exempting the wealthy undermines both legal authority and conservation goals. The medieval eel ban represents one of humanity's first attempts to use law to solve an environmental crisis. It failed spectacularly, but it taught lessons that are still relevant today. In our own time of environmental crisis, when governments struggle to balance economic needs with ecological protection, the medieval eel eaters remind us that the relationship between human society and natural resources is always more complicated than it first appears. The slippery fish that once filled European rivers became the center of a legal and social experiment that revealed fundamental truths about human nature, government power, and environmental limits. The eels themselves are mostly gone, but their legacy wriggles through European law, culture, and environmental thinking like a persistent reminder that even the most abundant resources can disappear, and even the most well-intentioned laws can make things worse. In the end, the medieval eel ban teaches us that environmental protection requires more than good intentions and legal authority. It requires understanding complex systems, respecting cultural traditions, and recognizing that human behavior is as slippery and unpredictable as the eels themselves. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see an eel on a menu, you'll remember the medieval peasants and nobles who fought, legislated, and schemed over these mysterious creatures. In a strange way, every eel dish today is a small victory over one of history's most ridiculous laws. The eels won in the end. It just took them 700 years to do it.